A disaster is looming. A fabulous city, rich in culture and technological advances, is about to be destroyed. Buildings, people, and an entire civilization will be swept away by an overwhelming natural disaster. This is Atlantis, the ancient land that legend has it was sunk beneath the waves by a massive cataclysm 11,000 years ago. The story has entranced scientists and scholars for centuries. Now we will try to separate fact from fiction in the enduring legend of Atlantis. Atlantis is one of the most fascinating of all historical mysteries. Stories about the disappearance of this legendary island city have been passed down through generations. The first person to write about Atlantis was the Greek philosopher Plato, more than 2,000 years ago. But is the drowned city just a myth? Or is the legend based on a civilization that really did exist? And why are so many people so keen to believe in it?
Like a perfect place, a Garden of Eden, the quintessential society.
It did exist, and I think it's still there.
It seemed like it was a very advanced society and that they had a lot of technology.
It's heavenly and pretty and resort-like.
If Atlantis ever did exist, where is it now? We're about to travel the globe in search of the lost world and explore 4 possible sites for its watery grave. Our journey will take us to the shattered fragments of a Mediterranean island that 3,600 years ago was blown to pieces by a shattering volcanic eruption. Standing here are the remains of a civilization that built the most ancient temple structures in the world before mysteriously vanishing. We will also travel to the Caribbean to investigate strange underwater formations recently discovered off the coasts of Cuba and the Bahamas. Along the way, we will meet some optimistic amateurs who believe they have found the lost city, and some serious researchers studying archaeological mysteries. But first, we go back to the very beginning and the source of the legend. The story of Atlantis dates back to 350 BC and the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Of all the writers of classical Greece, Plato is the only one who ever mentioned Atlantis, but he provided the key clue for our search. He wrote that the island of Atlantis was annihilated by a massive destructive event, and that in a single day and night, it disappeared into the sea. It's an incredible story, but is it really possible? Could a whole civilization be destroyed by a single catastrophe and vanish within hours? At first, this seems unlikely. Recent destructive forces of nature that our planet has experienced have not been that big. In 1994, the Northridge earthquake shattered parts of Los Angeles, and in 2004, Hurricanes Charlie, Ivan, and Francis decimated Florida. But they fell far short of totally annihilating these areas. But if we look further back in time, the Earth is indeed revealed as an explosive and violent place. Tsunamis have obliterated coastlines, killing thousands of people. And earthquakes have reduced whole cities to rubble. Volcanoes can explode with the force of nuclear bombs, destroying vast areas such as Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Krakatoa. So there are plenty of natural phenomena that could have formed the basis of Plato's account. At each of our 4 sites, we will try to show that they were destroyed by a massive cataclysm early enough to precede Plato's writings. To help us on our search and assess the evidence will be 2 eminent scientists. Geologist Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University.
This is very similar to catastrophe stories you see elsewhere around the world, common to many mythologies, common to many religious beliefs, and I suspect has a basis in reality.
And Ken Fader, professor of archaeology at Central Connecticut State University.
People have tried to make these connections, and it's been done so often between sites off the coast of Cornwall and sites in the Mediterranean. Say, that's the story Plato was talking about. That's Atlantis. Even the strongest proponents of those perspectives admit you have to change a lot of elements of the story in order to make it fit.
Both men have studied the evidence for Atlantis and compared it to Plato's clues. But before we can find Atlantis, we have to know what we're looking for.
Here, in the middle of our vast ocean, is Atlantis.
Over the years, the popular image of Atlantis has been colored by the imagination of Hollywood screenwriters.
Atlantis, a world that worshipped strange gods of science, a science gone berserk in the dread house of fear.
We need to ignore these science fiction fantasies and concentrate on Plato's original description. What clues did the Greek philosopher leave us? His description of Atlantis is about 40,000 words long and is peppered with remarkable detail. He writes that it was a vast city laid out in concentric circles of land and water. It was built of red, black, and white rocks. The people that lived there sacrificed bulls. The land was grazed by elephants, and it existed around 9,000 BC. But most important of all, it was destroyed by a catastrophe and sank beneath the waves. If any of our 4 locations is Atlantis, it must match most, if not all, of these historical facts. The modern-day search for Atlantis owes its origins to one man, Ignatius Donnelly, a 19th century politician and writer.
Plato wrote this little tale about this fictional kingdom. Donnelly ran with it.
Donnelly was intrigued by the similarities between ancient civilizations on both sides of the Atlantic. He thought that the pyramids of Central America looked remarkably similar to the pyramids of Egypt, and wondered if they could have had a common origin. In 1882, he published a best-selling book in which he proposed that the great technological advances of the ancient world had all stemmed from one earlier civilization, Atlantis. He argued that when Atlantis was destroyed, its survivors spread their knowledge across the globe, passing on the skills to build such diverse wonders as the Egyptian pyramids and the Mayan temples in Mexico.
It's really Donnelly who introduces the whole concept that Atlantis is this mother civilization, this core culture from which everything else in the ancient world derives.
Donnelly's theory sent Atlantis hunters rushing to the 4 corners of the earth. The story of the mythical civilization even attracted the attentions of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. They became so entranced with the legend that they started to include it in their own myth of an Aryan master race. In one of the strangest episodes of World War II, the Nazis actually began to search for Atlantis. The focus of their attention was a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. Is the elusive ancient civilization of Atlantis fact or fiction? It was described by the Greek philosopher Plato in 350 BC as rich in fine art, technology, and architecture. Despite there being so few facts to go on, Atlantis has spawned all sorts of weird and wonderful suggestions over the years about where and what it was. Possibly the strangest of these dates back to the Second World War. In the 1930s, the German High Command dispatched SS officers to search for proof of Atlantis. Some of Hitler's Nazi Party colleagues believed that the fabulous civilization really had existed and that the German people were descended from it. If they could find Atlantis, they believed it would bolster their claims of being the master race. One country that the Germans desperately tried to conquer was the strategically important Mediterranean island of Malta. But despite a deluge of German bombs, Malta bravely held out against the would-be invaders. In doing so, the island people prevented Hitler's Atlantis hunters from plundering their precious ancient treasures. These treasures are why we have come here years later. Could this island be the site of Atlantis? Just a few kilometers from Malta's capital, Valletta, lie some of the most intriguing ruins in Europe. Malta's magnificent megalithic temples were built around 3600 BC, 1,000 years before the Great Pyramids in Egypt. Who the temple builders were and what became of their culture is a fascinating mystery. Adriana Cacciatolo works for the Maltese Tourist Authority and has studied the history of the island's temple sites. She thinks the early civilization that lived here was so advanced that it could certainly have been the basis for the Atlantis story.
At the time of their construction, they were the most sophisticated and advanced architecture anywhere in the world. 5,000 years ago, no one else was building structures like this. They are unique, and in terms of architecture, they were very advanced.
Some of these stones weigh 18 tons, the weight of 3 double-decker buses. Moving them across land and raising them into place was an incredible feat of engineering. And there are other signs that an advanced civilization was at work here.
We have found very impressive examples of altar pieces with spirals carved in them. Also carvings of animals such as ram, pigs and sheep and fish.
Cacciatolo thinks that these temples indicate a further connection with Plato's Atlantis.
We also have evidence that there were animal sacrifices carried out in these temples. In one temple in particular, they found bull horns, incidentally also mentioned in Plato.
One animal Plato said lived in Atlantis is somewhat problematic. The Greek philosopher wrote that Atlantis was home to a great number of elephants. Today, there is not a single one. But in the past, things were different, as the island's earliest archaeological site demonstrates.
This is the cave of Ar-Dalam, the cave of darkness. The lowest strata of the cave dates back to about 500,000 years ago.
In this layer, archaeologists found fossils of animals that are not native to Malta, including dwarf elephants. How did the elephants get here? The fossils suggest that in ancient times, Malta was joined to both mainland Europe and Africa. Over the centuries, the sea level rose, turning Malta into an island. The animals were marooned and eventually died out. There are other strange remains on Malta that echo Plato's Atlantis. Mysterious tracks have been found all over the island, and some experts believe they may have been highways used to transport agricultural produce and water for irrigation. Plato described an intricate network of waterways on Atlantis. Could these be the same? But if Malta is the site of Atlantis, the ruins shouldn't be on dry land at all. They should lie beneath the waves.
We know of 24 temple units on 14 sites in Malta and the sister island Gozo. However, no one knows how many other temples there could be under the water.
Since the temples were built 5,000 years ago, the sea level has risen by almost 15 meters, which could explain the underwater structures. But this was caused by gradual climate change and cannot explain the sudden disappearance of the temple builders themselves.
At 2500 BC, the sophisticated culture simply disappeared. We don't know how, we don't know why. The temples were simply abandoned.
What could have caused this civilization to simply disappear? Geologists have found evidence of a major flood on Malta at the end of the temple builders' era. At various ancient sites, mud deposits have been found containing animal and human bones, and soil washed in from the fields. Some people now suggest that the temple builders were wiped out by a tsunami. Tsunamis are usually triggered by earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Earthquakes in the crust under the sea can generate giant waves capable of traveling thousands of kilometers and devastating coastlines. If the people on Malta were destroyed by a tsunami, this would certainly match Plato's description of the floods. So could Malta be Atlantis? There is evidence of bull worship. Elephants did once exist here. And the civilization may have been destroyed by a flood. However, the evidence for waterways is extremely weak. The rocks are shades of brown, not red, black and white. And the temples here are only 5,000 years old. Our experts remain unconvinced.
Here you have a mysterious, very ancient civilization that we don't understand, we really know very little about. They seem to be very advanced in some ways, but just because we have these mysteries, I don't think that makes it Atlantis in Plato's sense.
The first of the 4 locations is therefore ruled out. Although intriguing, Malta's ruined temples don't offer any hard evidence to suggest they were the site of Plato's Atlantis. Next, we broaden our search. It's quite possible that Atlantis doesn't lie in Europe at all, but rather off the coast of America. In recent years, the idea that Atlantis lies in the Americas has become a New Age obsession. The idea stems from the bizarre utterances of self-proclaimed psychic Edgar Cayce. In the 1940s, Cayce made a series of astonishing claims about Atlantis, even predicting that it would rise again. Expect it, he declared, in 1968 in the area of Bimini in the Bahamas. In 1968, a pilot flying over the Bimini Islands noticed a line of rectangular stones beneath the sea. Cayce's followers were convinced that his prophecy had come true. The formation, about 360 meters long, became known as the Bimini Road. Laura and Greg Little are amateur detectives and followers of Cayce's psychic readings, and they believe the Bimini Road is part of the lost island of Atlantis.
There's 2 points of view on what the Bimini Road is. One of the points of view, which has been put forth by a handful of geologists, is that the Bimini Road was a huge piece of natural beach rock, and that it fractured in these straight lines forming squares and rectangular blocks, and that's what we're looking at. The second group of people believe that the Bimini Road was man-made, and what it actually was either a platform, could be a breakwater, or it may well have been a wall which collapsed.
If the Bimini Road was part of Atlantis, Greg and Laura believe that there should be other structures nearby. Hearing of a similar formation off the coast of Andros, the largest of the Bahamian islands, they began to search the area. In 2003, Greg Little found an underwater formation that looked just like the Bimini Road.
At first I saw nothing. The water was quite deep and it just was sand everywhere. Then all of a sudden, there these stones were. And I saw one after another, and then I realized, well, there's more layers. And I kept going further and further, and I couldn't find the end of it.
Didn't have much film left on his camera. He only got 2 or 3 shots of the blocks. And when we developed them and he showed them to me, I couldn't see it. So about a month later, we went back, and this time I got out and snorkeled with him. And as we went along, just regular seabed, and then all of a sudden, here's the blocks, and it's unmistakable. When you see them, it's just too consistent. The size, the lines are very straight. It's just unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I had no doubt once I saw it. I knew why he was excited, and we were both excited then.
The Littles are convinced they have found a harbor or wharf many thousands of years old.
It sits right next to the tongue of the ocean. And even if the ocean levels were 300 feet lower then, this platform would have sat right on the edge of the tongue of the ocean. You could have had massive structures on it, and it would have had a commanding view of any ships moving up and down this very deep channel that's quite wide.
Greg and Laura are not scientists, but they have spent years researching mysteries all over the world, including many theories about Atlantis. Now they've returned to Andros to look for new evidence that the structures they found are man-made. If they can show that the stone blocks are the work of an ancient civilization, Greg believes the history of this region will be rewritten.
Archaeology says that there were no human beings anywhere in the Bahamas till about 1000 AD, which is astonishing because we know that the rest of the Americas were settled thousands of years before that. And that would mean, if this was man-made, it would mean that this area was settled far earlier than that. So it would have to rewrite the history of the Bahamas. We think the Bahamas was part of a maritime culture that was in operation during the Ice Age. And that maritime culture, for lack of a better term, is called Atlantis.
In support of their ideas, the Littles have investigated another stone structure, this time above water. These rocks lie on a hill on Andros. Some islanders suggest they could be the remains of a hilltop fortification. This site has a commanding view over the ocean and the interior of the island, making it the perfect location for a fort or ceremonial building. No one knows how old the site is, but Laura believes it could have been built by an ancient Indian tribe from the Americas.
It does remind us an awful lot of what we've seen with Mayan ruins.
The Mayans from Central America could have crossed the ocean to the Bahamas, trading and establishing communities. In theory, people could have settled on these islands earlier than we initially thought. But if they did, what happened to them? If the Littles' theory is to stand up, they will have to explain why there are no signs of people living here before 1000 AD. If people were on these islands, they may have been wiped out by a natural disaster. But if some terrible event did obliterate them, what was it? According to the Littles, a massive comet entered the Earth's atmosphere around 11,000 years ago. It fractured into two major parts and millions of tiny pieces. The pieces smashed into the eastern half of the United States, creating the Carolina Bays, while the larger parts landed in the Atlantic Ocean. The theory states that the impacts caused raging fires on land and giant waves in the sea.
When those two big pieces of the comet struck the Atlantic Ocean, they caused tsunami waves that I believe wiped these islands clean of everything that was on it. That's why we can't find evidence of humans here before the year 1000, but that's why we can find something like the Bimini Road and this Andros platform. These are massive, built right at the edge of the water, and while everything on top of them may be swept away, the foundations themselves remain.
But there's a problem with this theory. Scientists studying the Carolina Bays have found no evidence of a comet impact. Rather, they suggest, the bays were probably formed by glaciation or wind erosion. Greg and Laura are still convinced that the Bahamas is the most likely site of Atlantis. But what do mainstream scientists make of their claims? Dr. Robert Schoch is a geologist at Boston University, and he is less certain that the Bimini Road is the remains of Atlantis.
I have to admit, I've not been to Bimini to look at it firsthand, but what I've seen of the photographs, what I've seen of the best technical reports, which I have scoured through, I'm not even convinced it's artificial, much less Atlantis. And I have had experience diving on other sites that were said to be artificial, and I found were absolutely natural, maybe unusual natural formations, but natural. You can get patterns in nature also.
So could the Bahamas site be Atlantis? The underwater rocks are probably natural, not man-made structures destroyed by a catastrophe. We have no firm evidence of a catastrophic event pre-Plato, around 9,000 years BC. And there is no evidence of circular canals, red, black, and white buildings, bull sacrifices, or elephants. If Atlantis ever existed, it almost certainly wasn't here. Once more, our investigation has drawn a blank. But perhaps our next location could offer more hope. In 2000, a team of scientists searching the seabed off Cuba made an intriguing discovery. Deep below the waves, they found huge structures that may have been the work of an ancient civilization. Marine engineer Paulina Zelitsky and her husband Paul Weinswag worked together surveying the oceans of the world. Atlantis was the last thing on their minds when they set off to search this seabed in December 2001. They have been hired by the Cuban government to search for sunken galleons containing treasure from the Spanish colonies. The seabed here is 600 meters deep, much too deep to scuba dive, so they surveyed the area instead with side-scan sonar, a device that uses sound waves to produce images of the sea floor. They didn't find any Spanish galleons, but they discovered something unexpected.
We saw a huge submarine, very large submarine. We don't know whose submarine, but it was right there in area on ocean bottom.
They had stumbled upon a modern military operation. Their encounter was brief, and the submarine moved away before it could be identified. But shortly afterwards, their side-scan sonar gave them another startling image.
The graphics had symmetry and geometry and architecture to it, things that did not look natural.
The structures looked man-made and quite modern.
We decided that it's probably something related to submarines. maybe it is a world underwater submarine terminal, you know, very large, really large one, like international airport.
They took the data back to their laboratory for analysis. For months, Zalitsky plowed through scientific literature, trying to find an explanation for what they had found.
Every day, I studied for 6-8 hours. 6 months later, I lifted my face to the wall, and there was this Mayan calendar.
The Mayan building on the calendar looked very much like the images captured by the side-scan sonar. To Paulina's eyes, the underwater formation had a similar layout to the ancient Mayan cities in Central America. Curious to learn more, Weinswag and Zalitsky went back to the site. This time, they sent down a submersible camera. The images they captured were highly unusual. There were regular-shaped rocks, some of them forming structures almost 45 meters high, stretching over an area of 20 square kilometers. These artists' impressions, based on the side-scan sonar, reveal what the structures might look like. They appear man-made, but geologist Robert Schoch is not so sure.
What some people see as pyramids, maybe other types of buildings, maybe some kind of regular pattern suggesting some kind of urban layout, maybe if you want to call it a city. Very interesting, very intriguing, but is it definitive? I don't think so.
What concerns Schoch is that most ancient ruins lie at depths of less than 30 meters. None have ever been discovered this deep.
To have structures under 2,000 feet of water and to suggest that they're artificial, you have to explain that somehow. Could they be artificial? Conceivably, yes, if there was some kind of tectonic activity, maybe a catastrophe like Plato describes, that caused them to sink so deep. But still, this is something that really needs to be investigated.
If there was a violent event that caused the land here to sink, no one knows what it was. But from circumstantial evidence he has collected, Paul Weinswag thinks the structures could once have stood on an island.
When our consulting geologist went out with us, he showed us the outlines of an existing island that had sunk.
Could the structures at the bottom of the sea have once looked like this? According to Weinswag, a story uncannily similar to the Atlantis tale appears in oral legends in the Yucatan province of Mexico. It describes the origins of the native people.
These origins were traced to an island that sank to the east of Mexico in a great cataclysm.
In one night.
In a single night. And this island had been peopled by a tall white race that had seeded the advanced forms of culture, architecture, astronomy, agricultural science, and so on.
So could the Cuban site be Atlantis? If the structures are man-made, then they must have been sunk by a catastrophe. But there is no indication of when that was, or any sign of red, black, and white rocks. And hardly surprisingly, there is no evidence of canals, bull worship, or elephants. It's an intriguing site, and science still has a lot of work to do here. But this is probably not Atlantis.
I'm not convinced that they're artificial, much less Atlantis. But do I leave the possibility open? Yes. It deserves a lot more investigation.
Weinswag and Zalitsky have already planned their next expedition with manned submersibles and vastly improved lighting and photographic equipment. They hope that next time they will bring back conclusive proof of a great ancient civilization that once thrived in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, our investigation heads back across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Our last and perhaps strongest candidate for Atlantis is an island that lies close to ancient Greece. This is where one of the most sophisticated cities ever to have arisen in the ancient world was destroyed in one of the worst natural disasters in human history. Perhaps this is, once and for all, the origin of the legend of Atlantis. In 1967, archaeologists sensationally discovered a beautifully preserved ancient city buried deep below the earth here on Santorini. They quickly established that it belonged to an advanced civilization, the Minoans, based on the nearby island of Crete. Famous for their magnificent palaces and beautiful frescoes, the Minoans controlled a vast empire long before the rise of classical Greece. But around 3,400 years ago, they suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. Could this be the civilization of which Plato spoke? The stunning discovery drew the attention of scientist and writer Charles Pellegrino.
The city itself was a very fascinating find. When they started finding internal plumbing through the walls of the homes, very advanced technology, advanced use of water, and aqueduct systems, the like of which we did not really see again till about the time of the Roman Empire.
Like many others, Pellegrino began to wonder if Santorini was the site of Plato's Atlantis. There are several similarities. The island's circular outline is reminiscent of the circular shape Plato describes. And from the small statues of bulls and the frescoes of bull leapers, it's clear that the Minoans, like Plato's Atlanteans, worshipped the bull. Plato says that Atlantis was made up of rocks which were black, white, and red. The same is true of Santorini.
If you pull rocks out of here rather randomly, you'll find the original bedrock limestone, the original bedrock volcanic rock, interestingly, just as Plato had described the rocks of Atlantis.
But there's one thing above all else that makes it such a strong contender. Santorini and its city were destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption.
We're right now on the very edge of an 8-mile wide blowhole in the earth. All of it going off right in this spot.
The explosion was 90 times bigger than the eruption of Mont St. Helens. As the volcano erupted, it spewed out a massive pyroclastic flow, a terrifying avalanche of hot rocks and scalding gases.
Races across the land, slashing down trees, ripping up buildings, acting more like a fluid than a gas. And it's also very, very hot.
It's incredible to think that a single volcanic blast could have wiped out an entire city in minutes. But this has happened several times in the past. This is Saint-Pierre on the Caribbean island of Martinique. The town sits in the shadow of Mount Pelée. The volcano is peaceful now, but on May the 8th, 1902, it blew its top. A superheated cloud of gas and volcanic ash surged down the volcano and tore into the town of Saint-Pierre. The inhabitants stood no chance. 29,000 people were killed. Only 2 survived. In more recent times, pyroclastic flows destroyed Plymouth, the former capital of the volcanic island of Montserrat, when they roared down the slopes of the volcano and buried the town. The ash and debris are so deep that today only the tops of the houses are visible. But the eruption on Santorini was much bigger than this. From the layers of rock and ash laid down in the blast, Charles Pellegrino is able to compile a detailed picture of the events surrounding the eruption.
That creamy layer out there on top of that splinter of land that's left at the rim of the crater is about 200 feet of white pumice, which is marking the eruption as it was building and building and building toward the final explosion, the Great Ahum. This eruption was going on, emptying the magma chamber, creating a weak spot in the earth, and building up toward the top here until finally the thing collapsed, released the pressure, exploded.
After blowing its top, the volcano collapsed, creating a hole twice the size of Cambridge in the center of the island.
In the immediate aftermath of that explosion, you would have seen the water coming in over these cracks in what was left of the island, and one of these ships would have looked like just a mere twig going over the edge of Niagara Falls, and this would have made Niagara Falls look like a little trickle. Almost 4,000 years of history was derailed in an entirely new direction. It was pretty much the end of Minoan civilization, and that's what we're looking at up here. It was the end of their world.
Could Santorini be the true site of Atlantis? It had a sophisticated culture, and it was certainly obliterated by a lethal cataclysm. But there's one problem. Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years earlier. The explosion at Santorini happened around 1630 BC, only 1,300 years before Plato was writing. It's a major drawback, but it doesn't change Charles Pellegrino's conviction that this may well be the site of Atlantis.
There are scholars who've been arguing for years over whether Plato really meant 9,000 years ago or whether he meant 900 years ago. What Plato says is, he says it's a story based on something real, and you have to give him the right to be able to exaggerate if what he was creating was a kind of fable.
So could Santorini be Atlantis? It isn't as old as Plato said, and there are no signs that elephants lived here. But the rocks are the color Plato described. It has a circular shape. There was definitely a strong cult of bull worship, and a huge part of the island sank beneath the waves. Is this enough to make it Atlantis?
How many elements of the story are you allowed to change and still say, well, they're the same story? Well, in some cases, we have to change how long ago it happened, where it's located, how large it is. I can make a rat a cat by changing elements of that rat, but that doesn't really make a rat and a cat the equivalent.
On this journey around the world in search of Plato's lost city of Atlantis, a variety of sites on land and under the sea have been explored. On Malta, there once lived a forgotten civilization of temple builders. Their phenomenal feats of engineering predate even those of ancient Egypt. In the Bahamas, mysterious structures have been uncovered. They may be natural stones, but some people link them to Atlantis. Deep under the sea off the coast of Cuba, sonar images have revealed what could be an entire island with buildings intact that sank into the ocean depths. And on the island of Santorini, there is evidence of the Minoans, a sophisticated culture living in the same region as Plato, decimated in one of the worst volcanic eruptions in history. Each of these places has fascinating parallels to Plato's description of Atlantis. But none fits the story perfectly. Based on the evidence we have, Atlantis remains a mystery, no more than a myth. In the future, more thrilling archaeological discoveries will undoubtedly be made in the world's oceans. Perhaps these will one day yield the definitive site. Maybe somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered, is the place that Plato called Atlantis.